Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today we're going to continue the series on Analog in Your Pocket. You're just happy to see me, and today we're doing part 2 of Cores Not Coming to Analogue Pocket. Because in the original episode I talked about PlayStation 1, Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, and kind of explained the technical reasons why those aren't going to be coming over to the Pocket anytime soon or ever. But I have a lot of questions on some other systems, and I always intend that I'm making a part 2, so you're going to be watching it today. Before we get too far involved, let me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, I have a Patreon link down below as well. But the number one system I got questions on from the original video was Sega CD, because we do have that on the MiSTer FPGA side of things, but it's one of those cores that does not come over to Analogue Pocket, so we're going to talk about why that is and why it probably won't be coming over. Because as good as the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive is, the Mega CD and Sega CD had a really nice library, and it would be fun to be able to play it on Analogue Pocket on the go. Because there's so many incredible games on the Sega CD side of things, and it's been a core we've had for MiSTer FPGA for probably around 5 years or so now. But the real delineating factor is two things in Sega CD. One, the Sega CD was more than just a CD player, it had its own hardware that could improve on the Sega Genesis spec, and two, it is loading data from the CD in real time over to the console. And those two reasons in conjunction are going to be why it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to get Sega CD over to the Analogue Pocket. Because think about it this way, the one CD system we have as far as consoles are concerned is going to be the PC Engine CD, but the CD-ROM attachment on that console really didn't bring any additional hardware. It was just a CD player that could ingest and then send over data to the PC Engine. There was no additional hardware on there, and the additional RAM cartridge was something you slotted into the PC Engine in and of itself and just added extra memory. Where on the Sega CD side of things, there's additional hardware in a Sega CD or Mega CD which expands the capabilities. So that would be something that would have to be put into logic. Additionally, like I said, it is sending data across from the CD, and you need CPU for that, and that is a big difference between the Analogue Pocket and MiSTer FPGA, which I'll get to in just a moment. But remember, CD media requires a different setup than reading cartridges. Cartridges are basically in essence an extension of the system's memory. It addresses it like it is just memory on board, and I know a lot of people want Sega CD, but remember, even Analogue, when they released the Mega SG, did not have Sega CD capability built in. There was an edge connector and you could hook up your original hardware, but even they didn't put it into their console, almost making me wonder if maybe after the Nintendo 64 FPGA console they have planned, if they're going to do stuff like Sega CD, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn on their own CD consoles, because the Turbo Duo having that CD support in FPGA clearly shows Analogue can make that hardware, and that is why they probably started there, because the CD-ROM squared, or the CD-ROM 2 on the left-hand side of that briefcase, is just a CD-ROM unit. There's no additional graphical support chips, there's nothing that expands any of the capabilities of the PC Engine inside of that box, the Duo R, or the RX. The thing is, the Analogue Pocket has those two FPGA chips, but compared to something like MiSTer FPGA, it is lacking any ARM cores whatsoever. It is just the Cyclone 5 and Cyclone 10 FPGAs with their associated logic elements intact, where if you move over to MiSTer FPGA, not only do we have 110,000 logic elements, a ton more, but you're going to have those ARM CPU cores which can and will be used sending data around, dealing with CD specifically, and other low-level items, and that's something that Analogue Pocket is going to suffer from in the future. Obviously, on the Nintendo 64 side, like we talked about previously, it is just an amount of logic elements, but missing those CPU cores, traditional CPU cores on the ARM side, is going to affect things, and that's why PC Engine CD support on Analogue Pocket, while really good, is still not perfect and still not comparable to the MiSTer FPGA, and that's not to knock the core porter here. He's done an excellent job. It is just a very heavy lift. So as far as Sega CD is concerned, it's probably likely that you're not going to see this come to Analogue Pocket anytime soon or ever, which I know is going to be a bummer to most people, because even though it's not as comprehensive of a library as PC Engine CD or obviously Sega Genesis, it still has a lot of games to love on it. But the CD format, along with having something like an additional bit of hardware to program in on the Sega CD side, is just going to mean that that's probably a non-starter, unfortunately. Now let's move over to the Sega 32X, the other console I got a lot of questions about, and this one would be something that would really be down to the wire. Maybe it's possible, maybe it's not, but my gut tells me you're not going to see it anytime soon, and that it may not be possible. Because while we are back on the cartridges versus the CDs as far as the physical media is concerned, don't forget that the 32X is an extension of the Sega Genesis. That means you have to have an entire Genesis core in the FPGA before you put the Sega 32X on top of anything whatsoever, and that would be a very close fitment because you have the two Hitachi SH2 CPUs, you also have the graphical chips on the 32X, and you need to strap them all together with the Sega Genesis off the top. And before you even ask, no, Super 32X CDs are not going to work whatsoever. You'd really be loading up absolutely everything, and that's not even something we have on the MiSTer FPGA side of things, and I don't think any developer wants to spend the time trying to get that small handful of 32X enhanced Sega CD games working on the core. If anyone asked me if it was worth it, I would tell you 10 out of 10 times it is not. And I know we have the Hitachi SH2 processors on the MiSTer FPGA side of things, and the 32X definitely has a slower SH2, but it's still part of the same nuclear family, so a lot of the code base could be taken a look at and used for Analogue Pocket. But again, now we have to get two Hitachi SH2s in, all of the special graphical hardware on the 32X, and the entirety of the Sega Genesis core all on the two FPGAs on Analogue Pocket, and that is going to be a tight fit. And like I said, it might be possible that it would work, but it might be one of those things where it could just be 1,000-2,000 logic elements over what the Analogue Pocket has to offer. And again, as I explained in a previous video, you cannot 100% fill these things up to capacity. You have diminishing returns once those FPGA chips get close to full, and when you actually compile the code in something like Quartus, the fitment and failure or success of actually building the core is going to come down to a lot of times just how full the FPGA is. This is not something like DaVinci Resolve where I hit render and it's going to render 100% of the time perfectly. When you actually try to compile a core, you can end up with failures, and the more failures you see means the higher capacity you have on that FPGA and what you've used as far as the logic elements are concerned. And I totally get 32X would be a fun time to have on Analogue Pocket. Just like Sega CD, it's not the biggest library, it's even smaller than that, but there are definitely some games worth playing on 32X. But it just doesn't really feel like something that we're going to be seeing on Pocket anytime soon, which is a little bit of a bummer, but it is a console you guys wanted to ask me about. But again, I could be wrong at least on this one. I know on the PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn side of things, the fitment in FPGA is just wildly over what can work on the Analogue Pocket's FPGAs. I'm still not even 100% sure how much of that secondary FPGA can be utilized, because obviously it is handling some low-level functions for Analogue Pocket in and of itself as far as how the Pocket functions. So maybe there's an outside straight chance of something like 32X coming over to Analogue Pocket, but obviously no one has tried to port it yet, and it really doesn't seem like the type of thing that is going to happen. It would be fun to have, but honestly, of all the consoles that can't make it in, 32X is probably the lowest on my list, but I would love to see the Analogue Pocket do a 3D console if it's possible. Now I got some questions about Atari Jaguar, and this one is really up in the air because we don't have a finished MiSTer FPGA Jaguar core. Obviously, for the most part, it is working on MiSTer FPGA. You can play games, and it will be able to be completed on MiSTer FPGA if anyone actually wants to do so. But a lot of the Analogue Pocket cores are ports from MiSTer FPGA, and if the core isn't finished, then it can't be ported. And that's one of those things the developer needs to come along and want to actually finish the Atari Jaguar in FPGA before we get a better sense of whether or not it would fit on the logic elements and overall technical capabilities of the Analogue Pocket. On this one, with Tom and Jerry and the 68,000, all of the different chips on board, it feels like it could be a fitment issue again on logic elements. But that's something that I really can't say until there is a finished core, so I can actually take a look at it and say whether or not with any certainty what would be possible. But the reality is the Atari Jaguar just isn't finished yet. It would be a great FPGA core to have because Atari Jaguar hardware, in my opinion, is wildly overpriced on the used market. I don't know why it's so expensive. It really isn't worth it. I'm not saying that the Jaguar doesn't have some stuff to love. NBA Jam's a great time. Rayman is fun. Alien vs Predator, absolute must play for retro gaming as far as I'm concerned. Cannon Fodder here, also a good time. But this is one of those cores, it just doesn't exist fully yet. So when people ask whether or not Analogue Pocket could support Atari Jaguar, the answer is I don't have the slightest idea. We need to have a finished core. And that's the fun thing. There are still bits of hardware out there that are not yet in FPGA. Atari Jaguar, PCFX, the 3DO, these are all things that could potentially work on something like Analogue Pocket, probably not on the 3DO side of things, honestly, but until we actually get finished cores, it really is hard to say. But the exciting part is there's still hardware out there that has not gotten finished or even started on the FPGA core side of things. There's probably still a lot of fun on the console side to come in the next 12, 24, and 36 months in FPGA gaming. But as far as the three you've seen in this video, I'm feeling like it's probably a no. But if you have any other requests, leave them down below. If you want to see more cores that the Pocket might not be able to handle, happy to do these videos. They're kind of interesting to talk about the different capabilities of similar FPGA devices. And don't forget, one day if there is an Analogue Pocket 2 with well-expanded FPGA hardware, a lot of these things that wouldn't be possible will be very possible soon. We just have to wait for Analogue to see whether or not they're going to do it. Short of that, thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. But I'll see you next week with more Pocket content. I'll have videos throughout the week as well. Bye-bye.